Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And here at the Good Faith, we are friends who help each other make sense of the world. And one of the important ways we make sense of the world is with a generational lens, thinking about how different generations possess different characteristics. And I'm super excited because joining us today is the leading scholar on this generational lens, Dr. Jean Twenge. She's a professor of psychology at San Diego State University. She's the author of more than 180 scientific publications and books. One of her more definitive books was on Gen Z, which was titled iGen. She's the first one, as I view it, the first one to really, in a major way, sound the alarm about the distinctive ways that smartphones are shaping and misshaping this current generation of youth. And we're going to dive further into this, but especially her 2017 Atlantic article, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation, was very influential in this conversation. And now she's published her magnum opus that looks at the big picture of generations. It's called Generations, the real differences between Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, boomers, and silence, and what they mean for America's future. Jean, it's a pleasure and an honor to have such an expert join us for this conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start, Jean, with a little bit of a nerdy exploration here, because I wanted to ask you from an academic perspective, how well established is this lens of using generations to make sense of the world? How your book points to the influential scholars William Strauss and Neil Howe, but their book was only published in 1991. Does this go any further back than this, or is this a new kind of lens that social science researchers are using?
There's been a tradition of thinking about generations since at least the early 20th century with the sociologist Karl Mannheim. And in general, there have been plenty of studies looking at, shifts in attitudes. That's been done for a long time. But until really, I don't know, around that time, around the 90s, there wasn't as much hyper focus on generational differences. So Strauss and Howe's 1991 book kind of got a lot of conversation going on this. They also had a book about Gen X around the same time, and I'm a Gen Xer. That's one of the reasons I got interested in this field, was seeing all of this discussion of my own generation, which was fascinating, but very little of it was empirically based. Very little of it was based on, say, surveys, actually talking to or surveying, Gen X young adults compared to previous generations at the same age. I had seen really very little of that when I started my career.
Huh. So was it mostly anecdotal or sort of just almost bordering on stereotypes without any empirical data?
Some of it is, there was a tradition of relying on, kind of like really, really kind of very broad statistics like demographics from the Census Bureau, but there wasn't a whole lot of psychological or even sociological perspective about changes in attitudes or in personality traits or in values. It just hadn't been discussed all that much. It was also back then really hard to find that data. When I first started my career, I didn't have to do, it was fun. I did meta-analyses where I would take thousands of bound journals, off the shelves to try to find how did college students fill out this questionnaire or that questionnaire, going back decades. And now we're in the age of big data. We have all these big national data sets, many of which go back decades, which are online. And it doesn't make it easy. A lot of times, there's a lot of sausage making and trying to merge those data sets. That's kind of what I end up doing with most of my time. But it means we have so much more data now. We don't have to guess anymore. We don't have to stereotype anymore. We don't have to rely on just the observations, of older people like talking about, oh, my young employees are different. We can go straight to the source, and we can find out what people have to say.
I find it so interesting that this is relatively a recent lens for making sense of the world in the social science tradition, because from my tradition as a theologian, there's actually a very deep biblical tradition for using this generational lens. And I want to just do a little quick riff before we get back to the social science part of this. And that's because a big theme of the Good Faith podcast is that we were not created just as individuals, but we were created also in the collective. And as a human collectives, we also reflect who God is in the collectives. We certainly do that as a church, but I also have been making the case we do that through our institutions as well. And listeners will know how much I talk about this. But another collective that we were created to exist as and to reflect some of God's characteristics, at least in our biblical tradition, is actually the generational collective. There are numerous biblical verses that talk about how God actually interacts with human beings through the generational unit. Psalm 105 says, "The Lord is good; His steadfast love endures to all the generations." It's the exact same verse Jesus picks up in Luke 150. And there's a sense in which not only does God interact with human beings through this generational unit, but actually He's designed it so generations influence each other. Psalm 71:8 says, that this author says, "My generation's task is to proclaim God's character, God's might to another generations, to those that come." And then it seems like there's the good influence and there's also ill influence. Classic verse, Exodus 34:6-7 says that God can actually have designed human life such that the iniquity of the fathers can go to their children and children's children, to the third and the fourth generations. So speaking as a theologian, it seems to me that we really need to grasp how generations are different and how they influence each other. And this is why, from a faith perspective, I'm so interested in the social science literature, because you have the data on how this actually could be working out in terms of how each generation reflects something of God and how each generation is influencing future generations. So you switch back to the social science lens now. Why is it so helpful to put on the generational lens to make sense of the world? What have you discovered to say this is a crucial lens?
Yeah, so it is just so different to grow up now compared to growing up, especially, obviously 100 years ago, completely different. 50 years ago, also very different. But even 20 years ago, it's just a completely different world, a completely different experience. So, my goal in the book is to help the generations understand each other better. And, again, to do that with the big data, when you can go, straight to these big surveys that have asked people how they spend their time and what's important to them and what their values are. And to try to trace that back decades, to be able to compare, say, boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and Gen Z at the same age. What were boomers saying at 18? These are incredible resources. So that really is the goal, to try to understand someone else's perspective. Because
okay, so
it's different.
Yeah. All right, let's pull back. What are the main generations shaping our society today?
Yeah, so the six that I discuss in the book, I start with the silent generation. That's those just before the boomers, so born 1925 to 1945. Then boomers, 1946 to 1964. Gen X, that's my own generation. That's those born 1965 to 1979. Millennials, I define as 1980 to 1994. Here, there's different cutoffs, but that's one of the common ones. And then Gen Z, 1995 to 2012. And then polars, some people call them alphas, those born 2013 and later.
Okay. And so why are these generations different in their characteristics, especially by these sort of time periods? What's going on? What's shaping these differences?
Yeah, so, traditionally, a lot of theories around generations have focused on major events. How old were you when you experienced one event or another? But events, most of the time, don't have a long-term impact on day-to-day life. What has the biggest long-term impact is technology. mean, when you think about why living today is so completely different from living 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, technology is the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah.
And I'm not just, when I say technology, it's writ large. I'm not just talking about smartphones or social media or computers. Technology is also things like the medical care that has allowed
Mm.
people to live longer. It's labor saving devices like washing machines. It's air conditioning, um, airplanes, all of these things that characterize modern life. And technology has direct effects on how we live our lives. And then it also has these downstream effects. And the two biggest downstream effects seem to be a growth in individualism, so more focus on the self and less on others.
Mm.
And the second one is because we live longer, we can take longer to grow up and grow old. So that's
Mm.
called a slow life strategy.
Right.
So the developmental trajectory has slowed down from infancy to old age. Children are less independent. Teens are less likely to do adult things like get their driver's license at 16, have a paid job. Young adults marry later, have children later, settle into their careers later. And then in middle age and older adulthood, many of us who are middle aged look at pictures of our parents or especially our grandparents and realize how much younger we look and feel at the same age.
Yeah.
So people joke about 50 is the new 40,
Yeah.
but it's actually true. And there was actually a medical journal article finding that by biological markers, middle-aged people are actually 5 to 7 years younger
Yeah.
than even 30 years ago. So you can actually quantify it.
That's so true. I think of my own parenting. I am also a Gen Xer. And when I began my courtship relationship with my wife, we were actually, for many months of our relationship, we were on separate continents. I was in South Africa doing some international development work. My wife was still back in the States. And how we communicated in in that time in 1992 was we wrote letters, and our kids are just baffled by this fact that that our first 9 months of our relationship we were writing letters by hand, putting it into this high technology device called an envelope, putting a stamp on it, and then we would wait for 2 weeks
Yeah.
for that person to receive it, then have to wait another 2 weeks to get a reply. It was like there was like a 4-week time lag on a exchange between us. And just when you think about that, how that shapes even how you conceive of relationships, versus the instant text, right? That it it I mean, for one thing, I think on the benefit side, it strikes me that we developed a level of introspection and depth because we had to put these thoughts in paper. We had to wait. We didn't get instant feedback and so forth. So I tend to think of it as positive, but I'm sure there's ways in which, I mean, but at the same time, she was less in my mind in an everyday way
Mm-hmm.
during that
Mm-hmm.
time we were apart. So, uh, and boy, when you think about all the other ways, it's just your point is taken that we live in a different world and we have been shaped by different influences. So I wanted to then ask you, since your goal in shaping out these differences was to help generations understand each other better, if you had to pick for each generation that you lay out, what would you choose as, this is the most important truth for somebody who's not in that generation
Mm.
to grasp about that generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for silence, I would say it's that silence were the leaders of the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, not
Mm,
boomers.
yeah.
So two most famous members of the silent generation, arguably, Martin Luther King
Mm.
and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Oh, interesting. You don't think of
So
them as the same generation. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So you think of those two people and the changes in equality that they worked on, and it really does show you how the silent generation is a real misnomer.
Yeah.
So boomers, I think there's a very common perception that boomers are all rich and powerful.
Mm.
And that is absolutely not the case. There were lots and lots of boomers who really struggled during, especially, that time in the 80s when there was a transition to a more service-based economy
Mm.
and away from a manufacturing economy. So boomers experienced that, many of them, when they were young adults and heading into their 30s at a time when it was at least felt, too late to change course.
Mm,
That it was they had to kind of change things midstream. If you were born in 1950 and you started work at a factory, and then all of a sudden all those steel mills in Pittsburgh, for example, were going away,
right.
then what did you do next? So there's this common narrative that boomers were made all this money, were really successful, and then pulled the ladder up so the millennials couldn't climb it. That we
Right.
hear that narrative a lot, but boomers are really in many ways the first victims of income inequality and the changes in the economy, not the perpetrators, because these things happened before they were in power.
Right.
Sure,
Right.
they may have perpetuated some of them, some of the ones who did become rich and powerful, but that perception that all boomers are well off is not true. I think that has to be understood. For Gen X, so I'll tell you, even though I'm a Gen Xer, that was actually in some ways the hardest chapter to write.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, because we got labeled in the early 90s with this label, Gen X. X is an unknown quantity, and we're still kind of that way.
Yeah.
We're still ignored. We're still sort of misunderstood. We're still sandwiched between these two bigger generations. And even digging into the data, there were certainly some distinctive characteristics, but it was harder, to really nail down how Gen Xers are unique. I think that what captures it the best is that we were the last generation to have an analog childhood.
That's right. That's right.
And
Yeah,
then
we or we were writing we were like me. We were writing
right,
letters.
right,
We were still reading maps, which is
yes,
another thing that baffles my kids.
right,
This idea that we
right.
took out this big map to make to find our way
Right,
through the
right.
world.
Yeah, here
Yeah,
here in California, it was the Thomas Guide.
that's right.
So, I mean, I bought that when I moved to San Diego in
Yeah,
2001, and then,
yes.
became obsolete fairly quickly after
Yeah.
that.
Do you
But yeah, I
remember
mean,
like when you would reach the end of one of those pages, you're like,
oh
I
yeah,
have to go
yep,
to
yeah, yeah.
A24.
I know that's right, that's right. Because for those who didn't grow up in California at that time, the Thomas Guide is a bound volume. It's not a big map like
Yeah.
this, and so yes, you'd have to then turn the page. So yeah, just all of those things. It's not even just that we didn't have smartphones. There was no social media, there was no internet. um, there were video games, but they were pretty primitive looking. It was just, yeah, that analog childhood. And then I think one outgrowth of that is that we were also more or less the last full generation to have a unified pop culture experience.
Yes, that's right.
And I think that's something that Gen Xers. I mean, you want to start making conversation with a Gen Xer who you don't know.
Yeah,
Ask them about Saturday morning cartoons,
right.
right? Or
Yes.
just whatever TV they loved growing up. And it was all, oh God, it was so awful.
Yeah.
You look back at some of that, I'm like, oh, it's so bad.
Yes.
But we have these
But if I
fond
start
childhood
humming the Brady
memories.
Bunch tune,
Oh heck
everybody
yeah,
hums along, right?
right.
And there's nothing like
That's
that
right.
for my kids' generation. That is that unifying
Right,
pop
because
culture. So you're exactly right.
right.
Yeah.
It's so atomized. Like everybody's
Yeah.
watching different TikTok
Yeah.
videos or
Yeah.
YouTube channels, and it's just not that unified experience. So the novel Ready Player One makes a big deal out of this.
Right.
It's another example of that.
Wait,
So
hold on, Gene.
for
Hold on for one
yeah,
second. Do you
yeah.
think that explains one reason why my generation is so troubled and puzzled by this sort of social disintegration that's happening? Because we experience society as having a cohesive whole. We experience your trusted news sources are these three
Yes,
major news channels.
yes.
And then so to have a generation come up behind us that just rejects this cohesion is so threatening to us.
I think so. So
Yeah.
a lot of those kind of well, a lot of the issues around free speech and
Yeah.
cancel culture, that is where it seems to break
Right.
between Gen X and millennials. So,
Yeah.
and that shows up in the data too. That's not just a guess. Um, so it is somewhat of a transition, but that does seem to be where the break is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So then millennials.
Yeah.
So I think for millennials, I find I don't think I can speak for millennials per se, because I'm not one.
Mhm.
Um, but I I I think I don't think millennials would say this. I'm going to give that caveat. But I think one of the things that certainly fascinated me the most in writing the book was to find that millennials are actually doing very well financially.
Hmm.
That's very counter to the narrative
Right.
that you hear, the broke millennial, or that they're going to be the first generation who's not going to do as well as their parents. So it's just, the evidence for that is now gone. I mean, certainly the Great Recession had a huge impact, and younger adults were not doing that well during that
Yeah.
period. But after that, median incomes roared back.
Hmm.
At least as of 2020, home ownership among millennials is only a couple of percentage points lower than it was for Gen Xers or boomers at the same age. It's a really small difference compared to the huge, perception of that. Um, and those median incomes, those are corrected for inflation.
Hmm.
So yes, it's true. Say, the cost of housing has outstripped inflation, but other things are less expensive. So that's what it means to correct for inflation. I think that's not, often acknowledged, that yes, there are some things that are more expensive, but there's other things like toys and furniture and computers and pretty much all consumer electronics that are actually cost less. So
Yeah.
this averages out. And so even corrected for inflation, millennials are doing better. And the St. Louis Fed has looked at wealth, and they had said a few years ago, ooh, millennials are falling way behind. They're not anymore. They have caught up.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and I think this is good news, and it's
Was that a
the ex.
surprise to you? Was that a surprise even to you? Was that like
It
when
was,
you looked
yeah,
at the? Yeah. Wow.
yeah,
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
yeah. It was, and so that's actually the part of the book that was excerpted in the Atlantic, and so I've been able to see reaction to that over the last couple of days, and it is fascinating to me how the main reaction I have seen is no, we're still all broke. Don't confuse me with the facts.
Oh,
And
interesting.
when
So,
I agree completely, that there are challenges.
yeah.
The cost of childcare is a huge one because a
Yeah.
lot of these income gains have been in the incomes of women. I mean, pretty much all of that increase, it's from women. So then heterosexual couples, okay, they want to have a child. Then if they're both going to keep up that income, they have to pay for childcare. That's a huge challenge. So we have to
Yeah.
acknowledge that there are some caveats to this. But still, that the reaction to your generation is doing really well financially is you're wrong and we hate you was a little surprising.
Oh man, it
Yeah,
shows you how powerful these generational narratives are that they
exactly.
will defy data, right? So yeah,
Right, right.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so and then so the millennials, Gen Z. Then we're getting to Gen
Yeah,
Z.
yeah. So I think for Gen Z, this has certainly been discussed, but I think if we're going to focus on one thing for Gen Z, it really has to be mental health.
Yes.
That the increases in depression for teens and now young adults, are just so huge, so stunning, so concerning,
Yeah.
and the generation acknowledges that, and they are very vocal about paying attention to mental health.
Yeah.
And it's not just because they're more comfortable talking about it, it's because more actually are suffering. And we know
Yeah.
that not just from reports of symptoms, but sadly also from objective measures of behavior like self harm
Yeah.
and suicide.
All right, let's dive into that because so I am have my own book coming out in 3 weeks now,
Oh,
4 weeks on.
exciting.
Yeah, it's on
That's great.
anxiety,
Oh,
and
cool.
it's a theological, spiritual reframing from anxiety, for viewing it just as a problem. It is a problem, but viewing it just as a problem to actually an opportunity. And partly why
Yeah.
I wrote it for with my kids in mind is wanting them to have a reframe on anxiety that this could be an opportunity for growth, for their own growth. But that's not to say just because it is also an opportunity that it's not a problem. It is a severe problem. And in my book, I wish I had come across your work when I was writing it earlier, because I say, well, look, I do the caveat. I'm talking about the response to anxiety, the causes of anxiety, especially for why it's increasing so rapidly, are complex. And because I was uncertain and unclear because in pouring through the literature, I would come up again and again because my thesis was that this has to do with something with technology, probably smartphones. But when I looked at the research, there was this demurral of that. No, 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 the data is not clear. And then I looked at your approach and research. Like, no, no, no. Actually, I think I understand more why both the social science originally was sort of poo-pooing the idea that technology was the factor, and became more convinced from your argument that no, smartphones are destroying this generation in terms of their mental health. So let's tease this out a little bit. Why did researchers originally not suspect smartphone technology as the cause of mental health anxiety, and why is what's been your response to that?
Yeah. Well, there's a one paper in 2019, for example, that got a lot of attention by saying, oh, there's nothing to see here. If there is any kind of link with depression or well-being with screen time, it's really small. First of all, that was screen time overall. They included TV. They included owning a computer. This was a very, very strangely done study when you really dig into it, which is what I did after it came out. And many other researchers did too, and found out that they made some pretty odd decisions in this paper. So that really didn't turn out to be true. When you look at those data sets, it turns out there is a pretty substantial link between social media use in particular and depression, particularly among girls.
Yeah.
And 3 different research groups, including mine, came to that conclusion. So that's not just me. And then, I think I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but I think there was also a lot of confusion based on the statistics that were used. And people said, oh, it's a small correlation. But if you look at it in a different way of saying, well, what's the difference in depression rates between, say, girls who don't use social media at all and those who use it heavily, say 5 or more hours a day? It's double or triple among the heavy users. And I don't see how you can dismiss that as small.
Yeah. So what is your thinking on the mechanism? Why are smartphones creating such high levels of anxiety, depression? What is it about this technological experience that they've been exposed to from a very early age that leads to this vulnerability?
There are so many different mechanisms, and I think that's one of the reasons why the explanation really fits, because there's so many ways that smartphones and social media influenced teens. So one is there's been a lot of this focus on the individual level. Okay, what's the link between social media use and depression among individuals? But these technologies affect people even who don't use them.
Right.
So social media is a great example. Social media is social. That's what it is. It's a way for people to communicate. So if you use it, then, as we'll get to, you're spending a lot of time on that and not time on more beneficial things. There's negative influences on there and so on.
Yeah.
And if you don't use it, you might feel left out.
Right.
And a lot of teens describe that. So teens will tell me things like, I feel like I can't win.
Yeah.
So this is a group level issue, not just at the individual level.
So like a parent could say, my kid to my kid,
right,
you're just gonna get a flip phone. You can't get a smart phone. Well, we tried doing that, and that worked for
I did too.
I
did that. Yeah.
How long did that work for you?
A while, actually. So my 16-year-old just got her first smartphone a month ago.
Yeah.
So, and we thought we'd do it when she got her driver's license, but we just put it off as long as we possibly could. So yeah, she had a flip phone for 4 years.
Okay. So we tried doing that, and it worked for a couple of years, but then, exactly to your point, she was experiencing herself being cut off from her friends as a result, and that was having negative social impact on her sense of well-being. So exactly, you're caught in between rock and a hard place on this.
Yeah. And we can get more into this later, because I think there are solutions that are more compromised position with that. I could talk forever about parenting and tech and like all of the challenges there. So some of the other mechanisms. So one is, if you're spending a lot of time on screens, particularly things like social media, where the algorithm keeps you coming back and keeps you on as long as possible, then you have less time for other activities. So we see this at the group level in particular, that right at the time that social media moved from optional to mandatory among teens, teens also started spending less time with each other face to face.
Mm-hmm.
And that's much more beneficial for mental health. Being
Yes.
there with your friend in the same room in
Yeah.
real time.
Yeah.
So we see that time pattern. Then teens also started sleeping less right around 2012, right when social media and smartphones became popular. Also, sleep is absolutely crucial for both physical and mental
Mm.
health. Not sleeping enough is a huge risk factor for depression. So that
Yeah.
clearly played a role. So that's the displacement of
Okay.
more beneficial activities. Then there's the actual content of what people are doing on social media. So there's cyberbullying. Everybody knows about that. That can
Yep.
happen in other mechanisms as well. Then there's just like all of the content on social media where we have to keep in mind social media platforms were not designed for children. They weren't even designed for teens. They were designed for adults.
Yeah.
So they're this free for all. And kids get on these platforms at very young ages, and they're exposed to a lot of adult content. They too often they can end up down wormholes because of these algorithms, particularly on TikTok, where you watch one video on diet. This happens on Instagram too, or follow one account on diet, then all of a sudden you're on the pro anorexia
Yeah.
pages and
Yeah.
videos. And then, there's the Facebook's own research for Instagram, showed these effects for body image for teen girls and young women in particular. There's the social comparison. They did a ton of their own research on social comparison and how that has a negative impact on body image. Tons of academic research on that as well. And just everybody else's life looks more glamorous
Yeah.
online.
Yeah.
A lot of adults have noticed that as well. And then think about being 12, and it just takes it completely to the next
Mm.
level.
So I want to explore this issue of intergenerational influence because, as I said in the beginning, the biblical lens is that one generation is meant to influence another generation
Mm-hmm.
for good and for iniquity.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're talking about this impact of smartphones on Gen Z, I'm thinking, okay, we can't just blame, or this isn't, Gen X has to take some responsibility for this, or at least we have to own our share of that because one, we invented the technology and social media platforms that we have inflicted as in many ways a form of iniquity on the third and fourth generation. And so we need to understand our own role in that. I'm also wondering though, are there other ways that my generation um, kind of was set things up for Gen Z to make them especially vulnerable to this? I'm thinking about, was there a way in which, because we were so preoccupied with our career or our advancement, we had a we were, sort of hyper individual we were the cutting edge of the hyper individualism, at that time, that somehow transmuted into our parenting with our kids that has made this worse. So can you tease out like what are these intergenerational and especially from Gen X, because so many of our listeners are Gen X and they are parents of anxious, struggling with depression Gen Z kids. Help us understand what's our own role in this process.
Yeah. As a general rule, I like moving away from the model of whose fault is it or who
Okay.
can we blame, because I think
Yeah.
it's pretty counterproductive.
Yeah.
These are big cultural changes. We're all experiencing them,
Okay.
and we're all trying to do our best with it.
Yeah.
With that said, yes, you can say, Gen Z can say, well, I didn't invent this. Somebody else did. And actually, I actually think there's some good perspective in that. I actually think that's a good conversation to have
Yeah.
with teens. Like, for example, if they're on Snapchat and there's a thing, the Snap Streak, and that keeps kids like on the app and using it when maybe even they don't want to. Well, who invented that? Was it a 16-year-old like them? No, it was some dude in Silicon Valley who wanted his bonus and
Yeah.
probably got it.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that, the idea of like social media as an adult conspiracy, it actually sort of is. And teens
Right.
love that argument, they're
Right.
all over that.
Yeah.
But, it's not like you think about your average Gen X parent. Well, they didn't invent it.
Yeah.
And they're not
Yeah.
necessarily the ones who are, it's a certain segment of the generation. It's the other reason why I don't like the whole finger pointing thing is, it's a little too broad.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so you have to pay attention to that. But with that said, sure, Gen Xers, we embrace these technologies right away. Um, and that's partially due to some of these business models, but it's also because they do have advantages.
Yeah.
Smartphones in particular are amazing. It's
Yeah.
just, what are you doing on it? And how much time are you spending on it? And are you pulling it out, when you're talking to someone else face to face? And is it in your bedroom disrupting your sleep? It's just, you got to find the limits. And I
Yeah.
think that national conversation has turned toward
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And especially, and I really think, Gen X parents and some millennial parents too are on the cutting edge of this now, saying, wait a hold up, maybe we need to think about this more and try to set more of these limits.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is good. That's a good development of, let's find a way to use these technologies for what they're good for,
Yeah.
and then put them away. And then
Yeah.
also, let's learn to figure out how these technologies can be beneficial, but maybe they're not the best thing for 12-year-olds.
Yeah. Okay. So you had adverted to earlier that you could go on for a long time about
Mm-hmm.
parenting. So talk to my Gen X listeners, parents. What would be your top advice for here's how you want to think about handling technology with your kids?
Yeah. So the first rule is no phones in the bedroom overnight,
Yeah.
no devices. Get all of that stuff out of the bedroom during sleep time. Now, this is for you, not just for your kids. This is a good
Right.
idea for everybody.
You got to model
For
this. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, modeling it is great. And, you'll sleep better too. Now, I know that for adults in particular, there are sometimes exceptions for work or other things. But for kids, like, why do they really need that phone at 2 a.m.?
Yeah.
It's, especially if it's in the house, just put it away from the bedrooms on a charging station. Now, what almost everybody says after I give that advice is this. They say, but I have to have my phone in my bedroom overnight because it's my alarm clock. I have some advice for you. Buy an alarm clock. So
Yeah.
there's that. So that's the number one rule. Then the other is, try to put off smartphones and social media with your kids for as long as possible. So the flip phone's one alternative. There's another. So my 13-year-old, because we moved to a place where she was a much longer walk from her bus stop. So we needed to get her a phone. So we got her a Gab phone. So that's a phone that you can text and call and take pictures, and that's it. You cannot download apps. You can't play games. There's no internet access. So that's nice because it's easier to text than on a flip phone. And she does. She texts her friends, so she can keep in touch with her friends from the old neighborhood. So it has that benefit. And then social media, I think the minimum age for social media needs to be raised to 16. Let's get social media out of middle schools. That is a hard enough time already. And of course, we're going to have to enforce that age limit, with the actual age verification. Right now, the age minimum is 13 and it's not enforced. I mean, there's 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds on TikTok on
For
a
sure.
regular basis.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's not supposed to happen, but it happens all the time. And that puts parents in a really difficult position. I mean, I think that's the other thing that we have to notice is, yes, let's try to make these changes, but pretty much all of us are struggling. I don't know anybody who's not struggling with
Right.
this link, with for or this issue around tech and their kids.
Yeah. Well, I really like, sort of your perspective. Look, it's fruitless to try to play the blame game, and the question is, how do we play the blessing game? How do we actually
Yeah.
turn this intergenerational exchange to one of blessing? In my book, I talk about how critical it is for parents to just accept their anxious child. That's the one, at least that is the one thing that parents can provide: unconditional acceptance to kids in their anxious state,
Mhm.
that parents can provide regardless of anything else. And that's something that they can do that no one else can do. They can deliver that intervention of unconditional acceptance at a dosage far exceeding anything else can in the world. What else? But I'm also wondering about other ways that parents can helpfully empathize and understand Gen Z better because of this generational lens. And one example for me that I think about is actually around anxiety, is because even though um, I grew up as anxious, I didn't know that. And it just wasn't a label, a category of anxiety and mental health growing up. And so it was described elsewhere, or I sublimated it or whatever. So I'm hearing my kids talk about their emotions so much more they say things like, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling
Mm,
anxious. They have language and vocabulary for it.
mm,
And in a strange way, I have found that that's threatening to me,
mm,
because it's not my experience of, or it wasn't the narrative I had for my own experience. So I think
mhm.
there's something wrong with them. There's something deeply, deeply flawed about them. So help speak to this notion, like what do Gen X parents like myself need to understand about Gen Z, that currently we may be getting wrong, and therefore misinterpreting, or getting overly anxious about it.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, this generation talks about mental health issues more openly. And, I think sometimes that's used as, oh, that means the mental health crisis isn't real. It is, as I mentioned, it shows up in behaviors. And if it
Yeah.
was just them being more willing to talk about it, we, wouldn't see those changes in behaviors. But they have the language, to discuss these things. And, I think we need to embrace that.
Yeah.
My training is in psychology, not clinical psychology, but still that's my home
Yeah.
field. And the philosophy in my field is just that, to embrace that, talk about it. It doesn't need to be hidden. It is better if it's out in the open.
And we've been talking a lot about the family context, parents and child, as the mode of intergenerational influence and experience. I want to move to the workplace environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, with my other hat that I wear vocationally, I'm a consultant for nonprofits and government agencies, and I work a lot with CEOs and executive director types. And most of them are Gen Xers, because that's, sort of the career life stage you are when you get to these positions of authority. I don't know how many counseling conversations I've had, not counseling,
Mm-hmm.
consulting conversations, management consulting conversations I've had with Gen X leaders, and their befuddlement, frustration, irritation with the new generation of employees coming in, which are primarily Gen Zers. So, Gene, what's going on there? Why why is there, in the workplace context, this sense of confusion and division and irritation and frustration?
Yeah. I think one reason is a lot of managers say, I just got used to millennials, and now wait, now there's another young generation.
Yeah,
And there is, and they are quite different. I mean,
yeah.
that generational break between millennials and Gen Z is by far the most sudden and pronounced that I have seen in my decades of doing
Mm.
this. And there's
And is
there's a
that
lot of
because of the accelerating pace of technology?
I think that's part of it, and I
Yeah.
think it's also just because smartphones had the fastest adoption of any technology in human history. Five
Yeah.
and a half years, from
Wow. Yeah, that's
introduction
right.
to
Yeah.
50% of people owning them, right? And social media had a little bit of a slower rollout, but there was a kind of a sudden shift also, around that same time in that transition between those two generations. And so you go from millennials, very self-confident, very optimistic, to Gen Z, who is not either of those things. They're much more pessimistic. Plus, there's this huge increase in mental health issues. Um, Plus, there's this, mid 2010s, I think a lot of particularly Gen X and boomers had this experience of like, wait, what just happened? Because there
Mm.
was this shift in the culture, um, partially based on some of this online environment, toward you say the wrong thing and you get fired,
Mm.
and we're going to disinvite these speakers on campus because we
Right.
don't like them, and we can't have this conversation, that words hurt, that words can be violent, and these are all things that Gen Xers are like, what are you talking about? And then for younger generations, they
Yeah.
take it for granted. So there's I think that's the other reason why,
Yeah.
a lot of people in the workplace are you know feeling kind of out of their depth. So messages, you're not alone.
Yeah.
A lot of people are feeling this way, that things did really shift.
So, one of the ways that I think could be an objection to this kind of generational lens as a unit of analysis here is, of course, the diversity within each
Of
generation,
course.
by gender, sexual
Mhm.
orientation, faith, and I think it's probably especially race, I would imagine, is
Sure.
where you can run into real problems to say, this generation is like this,
Right.
that generation is
Right.
like that. So can you
Right.
speak a little bit to that?
Yeah.
What are the limitations of this generational lens, and when do you need to factor in these other identity markers?
Yeah, so people vary in many ways. There
Yeah.
are many demographic characteristics that define people, and generations are, of course, just one of them. But they're a rubric for looking at differences in the same way that gender, race, age, and region are. It's no different. And people
Yeah.
will say, well, there's a lot of variation, over the generations. Well, there's a lot of variation among teenagers and adolescents, yet we group them together,
Yeah.
even though being 12 is very different from being 17. When people do analyses, they group that together. It's just a useful way of doing analyses. It's a useful way of talking about people. But we absolutely always have to keep in mind these are averages. There's plenty of variation,
Yeah.
based on many other characteristics as well as individual variation, in these things. The great thing is almost all of these really big data sets that I work with are nationally representative. So we're not looking at a little small segment of
Right.
people. We're looking at people from every background, all around the country, sometimes around the world. And then you can break things down by gender, by race, by region, and see. And, there are a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, a lot of the generational trends are remarkably consistent across other demographic characteristics.
Well, and it sounds like, especially because if you posit as you do that technology is the main driver, then there's just this widespread diffusion of technology across all of these different
Exactly.
identity markers,
Right, and I
right?
think I think that's why, especially the
Yeah.
more recent changes, um, because you look at some shifts in the past, and maybe they weren't as even,
Yeah.
but almost everybody has a smartphone now,
That's right.
so
Yeah.
it it,
Well,
it
this
is
is
more
why I think the
universal.
current conversation around our smartphones really to blame to me is shifting so dramatically to yes, they are, because for those, we'll put this in the show notes, but I've been following Jonathan Haidt's
Hmm.
Substack on after called After Babel, which
Yeah.
is a cousin of Redeeming Babel, I suppose. And you've written in there as well,
Hmm.
Gene. But one of the most interesting things to me was just how this phenomenon of teen anxiety is worldwide across
Yes,
cultures, like
exactly.
Nordic countries,
That's right. That's
Mediterranean
right.
countries, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that posits like, oh, there's something bigger going on,
Hmm.
technology and smartphones seem to be the obvious causal factor there. Um, Shift gears a little bit here. You make the argument, which I think is really, really important near the end of your book, that look, we really need to understand Gen Z, not just for understanding Gen Z, but actually for understanding where our society is going.
Yeah.
That if you want to understand what things are going to look like 20 years ago, look at what's happening on college campuses. And that I completely have experienced that myself. My first career was in campus ministry.
Hmm.
One of the reasons I did that was I believe that entirely, that this was the way that you would both discern and have some small influence on where the future was going, because absolutely it was a predictor, right? So
Yeah.
if we take that as the framework, what are, given the current traits of Gen Z, how does that foreshadow where society as a whole is going to be headed in the next 10 to 20 years?
Mhm. Yeah, so that's the last chapter of the book
Yeah.
is the future.
Yeah.
And it's very useful to have this data from very young populations where you can watch some of these trends. So one thing that was really striking with Gen Z was the shift in attitudes around marriage and family and having children.
Hmm.
So as just one example, um, there's a survey of high school seniors. It's been done since 1976, and they're asking how likely is it that you're going to have children. And even taking everything ideally, if things worked out exactly the way you want, would you want to have children? And that has been very high. Most say they want to have children, and very, very stable since 1976 until the transition between millennials and Gen Z about 10 years
Yeah.
ago, and then it starts to slide.
Yeah.
So Gen Z is just much less likely to say they want to have kids, or less likely to say they want to get married. They're even less likely to say they want to have a steady romantic partner.
Yeah.
So it'll be very interesting to see the trends in family life and in the birth rate over the next 5 to 10 years, because the oldest of Gen Z are 28. So they are coming into where they're going to be the ones of childbearing age almost
Yes.
completely, within
Yeah.
10, 15 years.
Yeah. Well, and that's happening again in every major society. We're seeing birth rates
Yep.
declining again, suggesting there's a broad technology driver going in this.
Yeah.
And for
Also
those who
individualism, maybe not
and
even
and
just
individuals,
technology directly.
that's
Yeah.
right. Technology and
Hmm.
individuals, that's right. And those
Yeah.
are mutually reinforcing
Yep.
dynamics.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
just for our listeners to point out that that is huge.
Yeah.
This is probably more than anything else that I can think of as a global phenomenon, is
Hmm.
something we really need to pay attention to, because every economy, every society, if it has a declining birth rate, there are profound ripple effects
Exactly.
at every level, right? And
Yeah.
just take a look at Japan,
Hmm.
and where they are now
Yes.
and how they are
Exactly.
struggling as a society because of declining birth rates. So it's something for us to really pay attention to and think about.
Hmm.
Unclear if there's any policy change, but certainly
Hmm.
for those of us who, in our own lives, it's something that I think it's worth thinking, like, what message are we giving to our generations about how they think about the future, how they think about
Hmm.
hope? Because I think, to my
Yeah.
perspective, is these are giving birth to to children is such a marker. It's so influenced by your perspective of the future and sense
It
of hope,
is.
right? Yeah.
Right. I think it's one of the main reasons why it's gone down with Gen Z,
Yeah.
is you have to have hope and optimism to bring in
Right.
a child into the world, and Gen Z's like, I don't have that, and that shows
Yeah.
up in lots of survey items for them. Just they're very very pessimistic, and I think a lot of Gen Z would say, well, we're pessimistic because the world is so terrible,
Yeah.
and although I acknowledge that we certainly have issues, I think it's useful to challenge that and say, is right now really a worse time
Yeah.
than millennials graduating into the Great Recession?
Yeah.
Is it really worse than in the 80s when we thought the world was going to end at any moment from nuclear
Yeah.
war?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, that's an interesting. I mean, that seems like that could be a potential example of this intergenerational blessing that I was talking about
Mhm.
earlier.
Yeah.
That if our generation could actually be a voice to the next generation, to actually be a voice of hope and optimism, uh,
Yes.
and not just backed by words, but actually also backed by action. Can we be people that are actually transferring resources, training, equipping, passing on our
Mhm.
skills, passing on our social capital to the next generation, so that they have hope and a sense of promise that that in our own careers, it seems like every one of us who are in Gen X, who are in positions of authority, we should be looking for somebody in the up and coming generations to say, how can I pass on something of my social capital, expertise, mentorship, so that this next generation does have more hope and sense of promise. And that's something we all can do. That doesn't
Yeah.
require macro social policy. That's at the individual
Hmm.
level as an option
Yeah.
for us.
Yeah. I love it.
Um, okay, well, this is actually a great transition to my little ending that I do with every guest, Jean, because it's if we are then to be a generation that passes on three things, I want to say we should be able to pass on: good news, hope, and joy. This is what every human being needs,
Hmm.
along with other things. But this is a great framework for saying, as our generation, we should be looking for ways to pass on these three things: good news, hope, and joy. So I'm asking now you, Jean, personally, let's start with the first one: good news. What piece of good news do you have to share with our listeners?
It's so much easier to focus on the bad news, isn't
Isn't
it?
it?
And
Yeah.
I think that that's the problem. Here's one thing that I will say is, I think, a great piece of news for the future, which is Gen Z is voting at higher rates.
Mm,
And there's for years been speculation, oh, this is a generation where they're going to be really politically active, and we could certainly see that anecdotally, but now we're actually seeing, as a generation writ large, they are voting. And I think that's a very, very positive development. Let's get young people, more involved in the political process. So I think that's a great piece of news.
excellent. I love it. Um, all right, hope. Now, this is the question to you personally. What
Yeah.
personal practice sustains your sense of hope?
Yeah. I think I would have to say being a parent. And even being a parent of teenagers,
Yeah.
where there are certainly struggles in that department, but just seeing your kids come into their own and seeing them have hope and optimism and reach goals and work hard and fail and then learn from it,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
that gives me hope.
That's awesome. I totally believe that. I'm seeing that as my kids get launched into adulthood. So Gen Zers out there, have kids because you're gonna feel more hopeful about your life as you do.
Yeah.
All right, last one, joy. Gene, what is one movie, book, or any other kind of content, if you prefer some
Yeah.
other kind of content? But what's some content you're consuming that's given you joy recently?
Yeah. Oh, it's tough to choose. I love watching things with my kids. So kind of whatever they're into. Um, well, I mean, certainly one of my big obsessions has been Stranger Things.
All
So
right.
not
Yeah.
surprising, I guess, for a Gen Xer, but it's so
Yeah.
awesome that
Yeah.
all generations are enjoying this. I mean, obviously, it's just a great story and the acting is fantastic, but that that the younger kids were, as far as I can tell, born the same year I was,
Yeah.
and so that pop culture piece is there too. It's
Yeah.
just that extra, sauce that makes it even cooler.
Do you find that in watching it with your kids, you're able to pass on something about your childhood and they're like, what is that? Well, let me
Yeah,
explain. Yeah.
a little bit. I don't.
Uh,
They don't care as much about that. They're more into the plot. But then I get that. That's fine.
All right. Well, excellent. Gene, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. So much rich insights you've had. I highly recommend to our listeners Gene's latest book, Generations. It'll be a great tool for you to both understand and also bless the other generations. Thank you, Gene.
Thank you very much.
And for our listeners, join us again next week here on the Good Faith Podcast, where once again, we'll be gathering around the campfire.